Hello everybody and welcome back to episode 3 of the Thomas Wooden Guide. Today we'll be talking about understanding the production codes present on most Thomas Wooden Railway items post-2004. And that is about halfway through 2004. They started at about codes about in June of that year. And they've continued pretty much to the present day. In fact, the new Wooden Railway items that have come out, the prototypes we've seen, have had codes as well. So the best way to start is by one of the
most boring methods possible.
That is simply a list. So these are the main factories that produced Thomas Wooden Railway from 04 all the way up to 21. And now you're about to hear me basically drivel on about what each of these letters mean. Starting with WJ, this was one of the most consistent factories pretty much out of the whole range, running straight from 2004 to earlier 2012. Bearing in mind that the final items produced were not produced at this factory, rather at the TFI factory down here. You'll also note that each of these two letters for each of these are all followed by 2 zeros or 2 O's. This is the way they're stylized on items, that's why I've stylized them the way here, but it is far easier to refer to these factories by their first two codes. That's the WJ factory, as opposed to the TFI factory. Like I said, longest running and pretty consistent in terms of production. They tended to also, and this is a very weird quirk, they tended to do productions in weekly batches, which means that items are never usually coded as being produced on a certain day. Rather, they're coded as being produced for that week. And it's always Mondays. So, a very interesting quirk. None of the other factories share this, and they did towards the end start to go a little bit janky. But you could potentially blame that on the fact that Tomy took over and they were sort of trying to run the range out. So extra codes, extra production. The next factory is WYOO. Now, the best way to explain this factory is it produced one thing. And I'm not even convinced it's a separate factory. Rather, I think it's just a subsidiary of WJ. It's got maybe like 2 codes for 04, and that's it. And I've only ever seen anything on the Waterworks cars. So, I'm not really sure what the point of this code was. We may as well get the other 2 really worthless ones out of the way too. AZOO and SSOO. There's not really much to say about these. I reckon they were just, because of the lead paint crisis, they're just a way to get more items out. They're seen on, I think, most post-recall items. As well as, weirdly, the SSOO is weirdly an Oliver. They don't really make much sense. Following this, we have the lead paint code, OWOO. I'd also like to dispel a myth. Thomas Wooden Railway, if you're watching, you suck. Mainly because you claimed that these were recall codes. I want to make very clear, these are not recall codes. These are production codes. I don't know why you'd say that. Because they were present before the recall. You may ask, why weren't they present on earlier items? And that's really hard to say. The earliest codes were box codes, and they only date back to 2004 as well, albeit a little bit earlier. The earliest I think I've seen for a box code is about 145, although I may not be right, but I do have a code spreadsheet. If anyone's interested in seeing that, let me know and I'll send you the link. Either way, OWOO was not all lead paint, and ran from 04 to very early 07, when the lead paint crisis struck. As an interesting matter of fact, the OW codes don't end where you think they'd end. That is, when the lead paint crisis became global news. Rather, they end a little bit earlier. Which would indicate to me that they knew about the lead paint crisis before they told the public. I'm not angry at them for this. It's just something that may be interesting to note. Continuing on from this, we have the TFI, which basically took over where OW left off. While the majority of production was handled at WJ, TFI handled a lot of the secondary lines, i.e. they handled all of the early engineers and all of the Talking Railway series items. Interestingly as well, OW actually handled the majority of the original Talking engines, up until that job was given back to WJ. TFI would run out the final items in 2012. We think some of the last ones being characters like Kelly, and other characters, I think, such as Emily, I think, was very much towards the end, and so was Spencer. Interestingly, though, despite TFI taking on a lot of the later items, i.e. Kelly, and a lot of the pack, they didn't actually take on Nelson, which means, code-wise, Nelson has one of the shortest histories of any Thomas Wooden Railway item, with all production occurring in a 117-day period. Does this make him rarer? That's hard to say. There are items that have less codes for sure, but then again, these are also items that were produced before 04. It's really up to you. Which leaves us with the weirdest one, 3IOO. Now I hazard at calling the 3-part part of the code at all, but it realistically makes more sense because these are all worked out in the same format. You may say, why haven't you gone to the format? Well, actually, that's already in episode I, where I briefly talked about it. If you've missed episode I, I'll give you a very brief refresher right now. The format is quite simple. The first 3 characters are the day of the year. That is, the day in a 365-day format. With the 001 code, for instance, being the 1st of January. With the 4th code in the sequence denoting the year. Then, the 3 digits after that, or 3 letters after that, are the factory number, and the 00 just seems to be there for some reason. But 3IOO is very odd. Very limited production at this factory, and all the items have weird quirks. I, for instance, own an Edward, and the Edward has weird pupils. I own a Thomas as well, who has a similar problem. I've got a Henry that has thinner lining. Again, all very odd quirks, and something that really that needs a whole other video dedicated to it, and trying to unravel the mystery. But all you need to know is it's very scarce. While not necessarily more valuable, I would argue they are a little bit more collectible. You definitely don't see them too often, and definitely new in box, they don't show up. As a side note as well, I believe that the majority of these, especially Edward for instance, are uncoded examples, so it's really hard to prove. However, the quirks are there, and they are quite jarring if you really look into them. Which leads us over to Mattel. Now, Mattel's production sucks because they could not decide on a factory to save their life. They started production in 2012 with TAT and RSS, with TAT, I believe, handling the bulk of the bogeyed engines, while RSS handled the bulk of the tank engines. This is a very similar trend you'll see going throughout production, with RSQ handling the majority of the tank engines again, I'm pretty sure, and KQ handling the majority of the tender engines. XX, on the other hand, is a very bizarre code, only present on a few items ranging from 2014 to 2017. The most notable that used this code would be the 1945 and 2015 Thomas Pack. Which leads us to KW, which I think was just a revision of the KQ code, but this code was more prevalent on a lot more items, so it's a more diverse code. Bringing us to TLE, another code that really warrants its own video. This is the code used on a lot of the large box or small-faced 2017 items. Again, something for another video, but worth noting. A character like Hugo, for instance, was only ever in the TLE format. Next we have DS, which is not the video game system, rather the Wood code. This began in 2017, and interestingly, I'll also point this out, TLE and DS is the first time ever in the coding system that there's been crossover, i.e. TLE codes go into the DS production. Interestingly, when Mattel took over from Wooden Railway, it was pretty much just a complete swap on one day, where the last TFI code was literally the day before the first TAT. Could there be crossover? Some people have purported that there might have been on Twitter. I'm in the opinion that I'm doubtful. It's not as if production's going from one subset of a company to another, so they can cross over. Rather, we're talking about two separate organizations swapping. Because it's also worth noting that Learning Curve, which was by this point Tomy, didn't stop producing wooden products. You have to remember that Chuggington also existed, and they actually used a code called the WJ01 code after the Thomas line was sold to Mattel. What I think this means is that they downscaled production for Chuggington, so they only produced in a few factories. I think off the top of my head there are 2 factories for Chuggington as opposed to at this time there was 2 factories for Wooden Railway. Finally, we have the MK, which is for the new Wooden Railway line, with the prototypes on Twitter having this code. This started in 2021, and I am very confident that it's the code that will continue later on. You also know with the wood code, I've finished it at 2020. Now, I'm not actually sure if 2021 codes exist for wood yet, partly because with wood, it's a lot harder to find unboxed or the bottoms of engines new in box. So it's harder to actually figure out. As a matter of fact, on my spreadsheet, I've got pretty lengthy parts dedicated to these ones, but when we get to DS, we have very much a lack. Now, some people have claimed that wood was a complete failure, partly because there was just way less production. I'm not convinced. Personally, I'd like to see more codes first before I make such an assumption that it was a complete failure. These are just some examples I wanted to show of codes, because I think in my first video that's now taken down, I briefly mentioned the colors and whatnot. But there are some different formats for each coding system. I believe there's another... No, that's it. So, take for instance TFI. Towards the beginning was in red, which was very interesting. OWOO was usually always a split code system. I think sometimes, though, you may see examples that have the first 3 and then the 4th digit closer to the OW section. You also have some codes written in this darker green font. These are one of the hardest codes to see and are really frustrating. Codes like this only really occurred in the mid-range, 2005-2007, which unfortunately is the bulk of production for a lot of characters, including a 07 Neil and Troublesome Truck, which really needs its own video dedicated to it. I can't believe I haven't made that yet, because I talk about them endlessly. Just to give you an idea, this is a DS code. This is an interesting one. So usually with the Express Coach, the code is down here. But on this early example of a code from, I think it's the 3rd or 4th production, when they started using codes, it's actually to the right. Now, I've never seen this before, and I doubt I'll ever see it again. But it's just a weird quirk of the early coding systems. Another weird quirk is this Kelly, which features the Tomy logo prominently, which is just unusual. I only ever seen it on Bogey engines, and I've seen it, I think, on a Gordon and a Spencer. It's a very cool thing to see, but not particularly noteworthy. I'd love to get a full collection of these, though, just for shits and giggles. As well as this small other font, you see this on a lot of other Tomy items. I mean, yeah, a lot of the Tomy era stuff. The only code I just realized I haven't put here, which is a bit unfortunate, is the letter code. This was basically towards the very end of production, or I think they were splitting it up into different batches. So you start to see codes like the DO212 code. The D, I believe, just is a subset of a different production run. And they did this for a couple, so you'll see some different letter combinations towards the start. Mainly this just denotes some later production items. And it's only really prevalent, like I said, on the 2012 pieces. What's interesting, though, is there actually is some crossover between them and the items produced for Chuggington. So sometimes their codes will fill each other in, which is what I've got on my spreadsheet as well. So that's pretty much it on the code deep dive. As for the sources of these images, I know for a fact these 3 are from a eBay seller on eBay. This one's from Fatty, and I can't remember where I got these 2 because these are part of a larger code keeping program. So all I can really say is thank you all very much for watching this video. It's a lot more in-depth and a lot more of my sort of thoughts than some of the earlier videos. But that's partly because codes is something that I am very passionate about and I have talked about at stupid length. It's really is one of my larger areas. And there's not very many people in the community who know much about these. But I hope this has enlightened some people. But actually, there's one more thing. that I just realized is important to mention about all these factories before we conclude. And it's something that's really actually quite nice. You'll note here there is never any complications. That is, you never have to deal with the problem of an item of asking the question if an item's from 2012 or 2022. Because they changed the factories and code so much, it's not really a problem. So if it's a learning curve item and it's got a 9, or if it's got a 2, it's pretty certain that the items are from 2009 and 2012. You don't have to worry about any crossover. Just thought I'd throw that in there as a just random side note. But like I said, very heavy topic. If anyone wants to see the spreadsheet again, please send me a comment or link me somewhere. And that's pretty much all. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments as well. Thank you all very much for watching, and bye for now.